familiar passage, very encouraging passage. Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the what? Still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou hast anointed my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will what? Dwell in the house of the Lord forever. May God add his blessing to the reading of his word.
I'm going to have one more word of prayer before we get started this morning. Father, we're grateful to be here in your house of prayer and worship. We ask that your Spirit would be with each and every listener, both here and online, as we look at principles in Scripture. May each heart and mind be impressed just the way you see they need it. And may we go from this place more firmly connected with you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Just getting over a head cold, so I hope you'll excuse me while I at times wet my whistle and move through this morning's subject. The sermon title is Be Not Afraid. What does it mean to be afraid? It is a pretty common human experience. I think everybody here in the room has experienced some fear. Have you wondered if it's wrong to be afraid? Is it good to be afraid? If it's not wrong, is it good? What is the purpose of being fearful? Is there a purpose? What does it mean to be afraid? Other than being consulted to deal with pain, in my line of work as an anesthesiologist, I most commonly am called upon to deal with anxiety or fear. And because I'm a word kind of guy, I wanted to distinguish for you the difference between anxiety and fear. They are not the same. To be anxious and to be fearful is not the same experience. Being anxious is a problem with low confidence. And I mentioned this in the first service. I hated psychiatry. I had to remediate psychiatry, otherwise I wasn't going to pass medical school. But there are a couple things I learned in psychiatry that were actually particularly helpful. And one is the distinction between anxiety and fear. Confidence is the opposite of anxiety. And it is what psychiatrists try to build in patients when they're trying to deal with anxiety problems. It is difficult to neutralize anxiety. But confidence and anxiety are like matter and antimatter. The reason why you feel anxious is because you lack sufficient confidence to overcome or neutralize the amount of anxiety that you're experiencing. If you did, the anxiety would go away. It's a lot like pluses and minuses in chemical reactions or in physics. But fear is a little bit different. Fear has specificity. And if you read in your Bible, the word phobos is how it comes up in the Greek in the New Testament. Phobos is where we get phobias. in English. We have phobias, claustrophobia, fear of being closed in a small space. Arachnophobia, anybody here scared of spiders? Spiders, for whatever reason, terrify many people. Those are specific, and that's what makes fear different from anxiety. It also makes it much more treatable. Death is actually the second most common fear amongst humanity. The most common fear is public speaking. I'm not particularly concerned with either of those. My fear, would anyone care to guess what one of my greatest fears in life that I've had to deal with? My mother thought it was medical school because she happens to know that the only recurring dream I have is a nightmare, and it's me being in medical school again. It's terrifying. It's always test day. It's typically test day. My last one, it wasn't test day. I had like 2 weeks to get ready for the entire 4 years. It was terrible. That wasn't my fear. Otherwise, I would have dropped out, right? So, my most, if you could have a cherished fear, I don't cherish the fear, but one of my most intense fear is a fear of heights. I hate heights. Maybe that's why me and MacGyver just bonded when I was a kid. MacGyver hated heights. One thing you can do, though, to deal with any fear, psychiatrists call it flooding. I gave the example this morning of fear of water. Some people are afraid of drowning or fear of water. They will just take you and put you in water and hold you there thrashing and screaming, and then pull you out and ask you, have you died yet? And you just do that, and they finally realize this isn't killing me. And the fear level really starts to drop quite quickly. They can throw a bunch of spiders on you. And so that you're flooding the senses with that which is unreasonably causing you anxiety. And it very quickly allows you to advance out of what they would describe as a less mature development of character. That doesn't mean I think you're a bad person or you're childish just because you dislike spiders. We all have our thing. Mine was heights. I picked this image because it is reminiscent of the passage we looked at together, Psalms 23. It's very pastoral, it's peaceful, it's quiet, it's green. There's this river of wonderful waters in there. But mountains are what I was able to use to deal with this intense, unreasonable fear of heights. This occurred when I was in medical school. My roommate got more involved in his studies and quit climbing with his climbing partner. His climbing partner was Don Schneider Jr., whose father, Don Schneider Sr., was president of North American Vision. Don came to me and said, why don't you go climbing with me? And I said, because I don't want to. He said, well, I need a climbing partner. You have to understand, Don was a trad climber. We call it trad climber. You know what traditional climbers use things like this. We call this pro, which is short for protection. It protects you from falling. This is a new cam that's placed in a crack or crevice in a rock. You can put it in a short dimension. You flip it, it goes to a long dimension, and then it will not come out of the crack. And you can put your rope through the carabiner and climb up, knowing that you're protected. If you fall, you can only fall so far. Well, Don was a trad climber, which means when you climb up and you place your pro and you get to the top, you either leave several $100s worth of pro stuck in the cracks, or you have a climbing partner who will come up behind you and clean it and take it out of the mountain and give it back to you when you're on the top, and you can climb down together, or you can rappel off of the bolts that are screwed into the rock at the very top. We did both. But he needed somebody to clean the rock because he was not a free climber. Free climbers sometimes will use some pro, but they'll often go with nothing, and that way they don't need a partner, and they don't need to carry the rope. You have to carry a lot of weight. I had a picture I was going to show you. About a 100-pound pack, it looked like, that we would carry. The rope is one of the heaviest things, but you have about 4 or 5 racks of stuff like this dangling on you if, as Don was, you're a lead climber. We would call that in the 90s the sharp end of the rope, because that's where you're going to get cut up the most. Because there's no one holding the rope above you. That was my job, to hold the rope under him. So as he would go up about 10 feet, 20 feet at a time, he would put another piece of pro, and then he would clip in to that, put the rope through here, and then if he fell, I would catch him before he could fall all the way to the ground. So if you climb 10 feet and there's no pro, how far are you going to fall if you slip? 20 feet, because you're 10 feet above the last place you put your pro. So he needed me, and I needed him. So he helped me overcome my fear of climbing. Now, when you climb and you have that large rope, it's interesting. It didn't help to know that the rope could catch a piano. You could tie that piano to the rope and push it over the edge, and the rope would be fine. That brought me little to no comfort the first time I went 10 feet off the ground, because that's how far it took me to get to the first piece of pro. To make things a little worse, when you clip in to the rock, you're still not safe because you have to get clipped to here. The reason why you come off of this, because you don't want your rope dangling on the rock, because eventually you'll wear that rope and you will cut yourself loose because you've cut your own rope on the rock. So you want the rope always sliding gently and carefully through something very smooth. So you clip this close to the rock, this close to the rock. Then you have another gate. You see it's a little bit different than the straight gate. You have a curved gate on this one. It's also a solid gate. But once you get in, you put your rope that's around your harness and you put it through there towards the rock and clip in and climb on. So that if you fall when I'm on the dull end, the next guy can catch you as he's resting at the next ledge. What you don't want to do is put your rope in the wrong direction away from the rock, because if you fall back away from the rock, you can come out of the gate and it won't matter that you used the rope. So depending on how you use your rope, you may or may not make it home. Of course, I never told my mother these things, and I don't think I've showed her any pictures. We often would use these. I think Josh fixes here. We used figures of 8 back when I climbed. Those are a little less safe. Nowadays, you can use these auto belay things that will just lock on you if you fall. Your partner could actually be falling asleep and unaware that you're just falling, because it will lock and the rope's friction will catch you. They can these days text, watch movies, take your smartphone, and go climbing and forget about the partner, because if they actually fell and you forgot about it and you're in the middle of a text, they'll actually not fall off and kill themselves. But when I was climbing, you couldn't actually use a cell phone and climb at the same time. These days you have some really nice stuff. Back then it was just, quick draws and open gates and everything. But this gate, this is a more modern carabiner. You can't actually open it with just one hand, or, well, you can, because it's got a lock. You have to purposely swivel it and then open. And then when you let go and put your rope in, it can't open again unless you yourself put your hands on it, shift it over, open it, and then you can get out. There's also a second one right there. So you go in once, you can go in twice, and even if the gate were to fail, or you were stupid and using your phone at the same time, and you unlock the top gate and bring it open, you're still stuck in here. So these are things you want to use if you're going to take your life into your own hands and do foolish things when you're young. I actually do still climb. My niece, Emily, is my climbing partner these days, and I had some pictures that didn't show up on my presentation of New River Gorge is where we went. It's about 6 hours north. But I tell you, looking at the rope, I think our tallest climb was about 1,700 feet. And you have to untie the rope. That'd be about, I think we had 7 pitches of a 150-meter rope. And when you get that high, it doesn't really matter how big the rope is. The fear never goes away. And like I said, for Don, it was different. Don had to lead. I didn't have to know where we were going. I just had to follow Don. I didn't have to know where the best crack was. I mean, the reason why you carry probably 36 to 55 or so of stuff like this is because you never know which one's going to fit in the crack when you get 10 feet above the last place you locked in. So you have to take a lot of options. I didn't have to carry any options. Don had to carry all the options. All I had to do was follow where he went. It was especially important, I learned, is to not look down. That is not helpful information. Looking down never helped me to climb up. Never. Looking down will never help you climb up. You look at the rope, and wherever Don went is where the rope went. If he moved left on the face, if he went into a crack, that's where the rope went. I just followed the rope, took out the gear, clipped it on my belt. He carried most of everything. I brought up just the things that were essential. So I was flooded with images of, nothing below you. And you have to do these things again and again and again and again before the fear level starts to go away, when it's a phobia. Some people get into it and they just love it and there's never a problem. That was not the case for me. I had to do it again and again and again. The Bible talks about fear. So hopefully that was just a brief illustration. You kind of get to know Dr. Cobos, a little bit different level, and you learn some things about climbing. There are climbers in this church. I should also add that it really, really matters who you climb with. Your climbing partner, it could mean your life and death. I'm not married, but I'm told that the spouse you pick commonly decides whether or not you live or die. Financially, socially, and eternally, your spouse does impact you in ways that you don't think about when you're a teenager or a 20-something-year-old. But I thought about that when I decided when I was going to climb. It really does matter who you pick to go with you. If they're not paying attention at just the wrong time, it can turn a 2-foot fall into a 25-foot fall. Anyway, fear. If you do a quick search in your concordance or on your computer and just search that 2-word phrase, fear not, it's going to come up 63 times in the King James Version of the Bible. The first time that the element of fear is addressed is at the fall of mankind. The phrase fear not is not used, but fear does come up. It's there in chapter 3 of Genesis in verse 10. God calls a bit of a council there with the members of this incident. And Adam speaks here saying that I heard thy voice in the garden. He's responding to God's question about where he was. He says, I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid. Had he heard God's voice in the garden before? Had it ever caused him fear? It never had, ever had caused him fear. Why is it causing him fear now when it had never caused fear before? Something had changed. There is something very different about the psychology in humanity post-fall than pre-fall. And fear affects us very differently now than it did pre-fall. He says, I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. So he's afraid, and what does he do? He hides. Essentially, he distances himself from God, and only does he come to be with him again when he's coaxed and pulled in by the voice of God. And he does so with some hesitation. So the lesson number one I'd like to highlight, sorry about the space there, is that this emotion of fear, when experienced in the fallen state, which is where we are now, it drives us to do things that we ought not do. And it keeps us from doing the very things that we ought to do. Now that's a particularly dangerous situation. It's bad enough to have the drive to do something that you shouldn't. But when combined with the resistance it can build to do what you ought to do, that's really bad. And that can happen in climbing. The last thing you want to do is to stop climbing. But fear tends to make you want to stop climbing. Because the more you climb, what happens? The higher you get. And the higher you get, the farther away you get from your last piece of pro. And the farther away you get, the farther you're going to fall when and if you slip. The emotion of fear drives us to do things we ought not to do, and it keeps us from doing the very things that we ought to do. I picked just a few. I picked three. Excuse me, I'll get there. First, let me say just a few more things about this thing. Of Adam deciding he's going to hide himself. That was his decision. He's afraid. He hides himself. He goes away from God. And he doesn't just go away. He goes away in a manner which he hopes to ensure he's not found. He hides. That's different. Hide and seek is different than taking a vacation with the family. You play hide and seek with the family, your intent is to not be found. Go on a vacation with the family, your intent is to be together. So hiding has a little bit different knowing that Adam is hiding himself gives a different context to what's going on. And it is sin which causes us to be separated from God. I want to bring that out in Isaiah 59 verse 2. It says so, that our iniquities separate us from God. It hides our face from Him so that He does not hear. And I want to be careful, like I did this morning, to distinguish the sin that hides God's face from you, that makes it that it is not here. And that is more clearly brought out in Psalms chapter 66, this verse 18. What kind of sin is it that causes the Lord to not hear, that really, really separates us well? It's the cherished sins, the sin that you really, really like and you have no intent or desire to get rid of. That's different from the sin that you commit that ought to drive you to close the distance between you and God and bring you close to Him and say, Lord, I messed up so bad. This is terrible. Please, can you help me with this? That prayer is not one that He will not hear. He hears, He loves those prayers. That's an invitation of consent to help the sinner. But if you regard iniquity in the heart, you intend to keep it there, there's no cure for that. I also want to be quick to mention, as I did it in the first service, that as we note in Acts chapter 5, verse 39, that repentance itself is a gift available to you. If there are sins in your life that you don't want to get rid of because you like them, I mean, do you like sin? There's sins I like. But if you want to get rid of the things that are sinful and you want them, if you want to get rid of it, that counts. God's going to help you with that. He can give you a repentant spirit that even if you don't want to give up that sin, if that's where you want to come to, He'll get you there. But this is not sorry, I backed up there. Yeah. This is not what Psalm 66 is talking about. Psalm 66 is talking about something you don't even have an interest, not remotely. You like it, you're going to keep it. You're not interested in a plan even to help diminish your desire to have it in your life. Those kind of problems will separate you from God. He will not hear you. That's what the scriptures describe. Okay. I picked 3 verses from this search to highlight and talk about as we launch into the main thrust of the sermon, which actually is prayer. In Genesis 26:24, the Lord appears unto Isaac and says to him, I am the God of Abraham thy father. Fear not. What is the reason given by God that Isaac should not fear? The reason stated is because I am with thee. The reason why I picked these 3 is because it's a recurring theme. If you should, and I recommend that you do, if you should go through this study yourself and go through and find these instances in the scriptures where the words fear and not come side by side, you're going to find this as a recurring theme. Fear not, the reason given, for I am with thee. Isaiah 43:1. There's a little bit more detail given there. He says, Now thus saith the Lord that created thee, O Jacob, and he that formed thee, O Israel. Fear not, for I have redeemed thee. I have called thee by name, thou art mine. Fear not. Why? For I am with thee. A little bit more than just the presence of God, I am with me. In this verse, there's other elements. Notice there's the Lord, the Creator. It's one thing to have your best friend with you, old college roommate. Oh, that's nice to be with them. But when the Creator is with you, that's a different level. When the person that formed you out of nothing is with you, that's a different level. When the one who redeemed you from all the things you've done wrong is with you, that is even a higher level. He says, I've called you by name. You are mine. So there's a claim of ownership there. And all of that is given in the context of, I'm telling you to not be afraid because I'm here. The question is being with God enough? Do you view God as enough? Or is he not enough to satisfy what you think you need or want? Do you fear going without God in your life the way you fear other things? Joshua 1:9 says, Have I not commanded thee? Be strong and of a good courage. There's that idea of confidence that we talked about a little bit at the beginning. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed. And again, what is the reason given as to why one might not be afraid or dismayed? For the Lord thy God is with thee. And this idea is expanded just a bit here by saying, whithersoever thou goest. So point number 2, or lesson number 2 this morning, being with God is the cure for fear. There are a lot of reasons as we start the year 2023 that you should probably be afraid. If you're not afraid, you're probably either misinformed, uninformed, maybe you have Alzheimer's, maybe you have amnesia real bad, I don't know. But there are really good reasons to be afraid. Now, being afraid, I confess, I don't believe that's wrong any more than it is wrong to be angry. The Bible says be angry and what? So anger and fear are responses. Those are actually normal human responses, either pre-lapse or post-lapse area, before or after sin. We're as much human as we were then. So I do believe God created us with the capacity to fear prior to sin occurring. It's what you do with the fear. It's the response generated, which will or will not cause trouble or actual sin. Being with God is the cure for fear. He says, fear not. Why? For I am with thee. But here's a reasonable question. We say that God is omnipresent. We believe he is. The Bible describes that. If he's everywhere, well then, why do I need to do anything to be with him? He's already here. I can continue living the life as I always have because he's with me everywhere I go. Is that just a little naive, maybe? Why is that, though? Why do we believe that? We believe that because being with God requires two important elements. What are those? That is consent and cooperation. Cooperation. This is described in Revelation 3, verse 20. Jesus says, behold, I do what? I stand at the door. And again, if you knew how to read Greek and better than me and understood the original languages better than me, you could explain to me that this passage actually describes him standing at the door. He doesn't just come and stand and knock and then go away. He's actually there continuing to wait. He's continuing to knock. He's continuing to listen to see if you change your mind. And while at one time you would not consent to opening the door, that maybe if he keeps knocking, he keeps standing, then hopefully eventually you open the door. When I do an epidural for someone at the hospital, usually they're not interested in talking about the consent process. They just want me to do the epidural. But I did have one patient change her mind 4 times. I went up to do it and she changed her mind. I had to go back downstairs to do surgery. Then they called me back again. Oh, she changed her mind. She wants an epidural now. Well, she said she didn't want one before. What makes her want one now? I don't know. I come back up. This happened 4 times to me. I think she actually ended up delivering without an epidural because she couldn't make her mind up. Must not have been that painful. I don't know. I've never had one. But consent infers the ability to change your mind. Where you say yes at one point, you might say no at another. And if you said no at one point, you might say yes later. Remember the parable, the 2 sons. Please go work in the vineyard. No, I'm not going to go. The other guy says, yes, I'm going to go. They both changed their mind. The guy who said he was going to go, he doesn't go. The guy who said, no, I'm not going to go, he goes. Consent is very important to God. It's not important to the devil. But to God, it is very important that you consent and you cooperate in the relationship that he's trying to form with you. He says, if you hear my voice and you open the door, so if you consent and you cooperate, then I will come into you and sup with you. And how's that described as being? You're with somebody. You're with somebody. I will come into him and sup with him. So you have to hear the voice and you have to open the door. You ever gotten a phone call and you didn't answer? Did you ever get a text or an email and you didn't read it? You did get the message, but you didn't cooperate by reading it. You may not even consent to a phone. There's this block feature I'm trying to learn how to use. I'm not going to consent to a phone call from you. I will block you. That's more kind of like the cherished sin kind of thing, right? But we can do this in many of our relationships. You can consent but not cooperate. You can not even consent and you don't cooperate. You can consent and cooperate for a time and then not cooperate, even though you say you still consent. There's a lot of little different nuances to this relationship stuff. I want to compare and contrast the way God does things with the way that Satan does things. Satan could care less about cooperation and consent. He doesn't need it. Doesn't particularly want it sometimes even. I'll give a couple quotes here I want to share with you. Some of these you should be familiar with. Maybe 1 or 2 is new. Lucifer, who became Satan, is said in Desire of Ages, page 435, that he desired God's power but not his character. Big difference. So a lot of people want to be the president of their nation. Coups are attempted. Military leaders seek rank and power. Power is desirable, but the character to wield it well is not particularly eagerly sought for, and Lucifer was no different. He sought for himself the highest place, and every being, who's that talking about? Us, not talking about Satan anymore. This particular sentence, every being who is actuated by his spirit is going to do what? The same. This is how alienation, discord, and strife become inevitable. Anybody enjoy being in a family or a church where there is alienation, discord, and strife? No, but it is inevitable if we seek for the highest place and if we are actuated by Satan's spirit. Dominion becomes prize of the strongest, and the kingdom of Satan is what? The kingdom of Satan is a kingdom of force. If you're in an institution, a group, a workplace, wherever, and you sense the strong use of force to achieve the goals of the organization, where does that tendency come from? That is demonic. That is how the devil and his government works. It is a kingdom of force. It has nothing to do with consent or cooperation. It has to do with dominion and force. It is no part of Christ's mission to compel men to receive him or compel them to do anything. It is Satan and men actuated by his spirit that seek to what? Compel. In fact, there can be no more conclusive evidence. By the way, if there were a court case and there's compelling evidence given, court case is essentially over. You have compelling evidence. There can be no more conclusive evidence that we possess the spirit of who? Then what? The disposition to hurt and destroy those who do not appreciate with our work or who act contrary to what? Our ideas. I found this complimenting passage from a book entitled This Day with God. It's a devotional book, page 371, by Ellen White. She writes, "There is no greater evidence that Satan is working than that those who profess to be sanctified to God's service persecute their fellow beings because they do not believe the same doctrine that they themselves believe." This, I hope, is more familiar. And this is the last one I'm going to use to kind of compare and contrast the spirit of Christ, the spirit of Satan, the way they work, the way they think, and how each tends to train their followers to behave. This is a great controversy, page 591. How often does God force the will or the conscience? Not even once? How about just a little thing? What if it's for your good? No, God never forces the will or the conscience. It was actually, I almost said Thomas Aquinas. It was St. Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, I think is what they called him. I had to read his book when I was in college. He was the one who invented the doctrine of which generated the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, to compel. Remember, there's a passage in the King James Version that says, compel them to come in. There's a parable of the wedding feast. Nobody wants to come, so the Lord of the house says, go out at the highways and byways, compel them to come in. So it was St. Augustine who developed the idea that means we will use force to compel conversion to Roman Catholicism. God never forces the will or the conscience. But how often does Satan resort to these methods? His constant resort. And what is he doing with it? He uses it to gain control of those whom he cannot otherwise seduce. So what does he try first? He tries to use the more drawing, winning, seductive, positive bribery. If those things don't work, then you use compulsion through cruelty. You use the negatively charged emotions. Emotions are very motivating things. But they come in two flavors, positive and negative. Satan likes to use the negative, but he will start with the positive because it's almost like a smokescreen. It's like, I'm doing nice things for you. I'm not a bad guy. I'm here to help. I'm from the government. I'm here to help. Right? Have you heard that? I'm from the government. I'm here to help. So through fear or force, he endeavors to rule the conscience and secure homage. To accomplish this, he works through two main worldly institutions. What are those? The church and the state. He works through both religious and secular authorities. He uses the church and the state, and he uses them to move them to enforce laws, human laws, in defiance to divine laws, or the laws of God. And why would he do that? Well, because if you're obeying laws that are not God's law, and you're breaking God's laws, that disqualifies you from being a member of that kingdom. And he knows that. That will qualify you eminently to be a part of his kingdom, and would disqualify you at the same time from being a member of God's kingdom. That's his goal. So, to underscore that point, being with God requires consent and cooperation. So this is really what the sermon's about. The sermon's about prayer. All that is to say, we need to have a brief discussion about prayer. Prayer is how we spend time with God. Remember, being with God is what? The cure for fear. And is fear a large element of human experience in the year 2022 or not? And is it said in the book of Revelation that fear will play a determining factor in whether or not you're inside or outside the city? Because outside the city there are who? The fearful, the unbelieving. Those are key features that the devil needs to develop in you to make sure you don't get redeemed. Fear and unbelief. Fear is a particularly good one, though. I had mentioned from the pulpit several times a book, the Discipleship Handbook. We still have several copies right here at church. I encourage you to either get one, buy one. I lifted these out. I'm not that creative. I didn't just come up with this. I stole it from this book, the Discipleship Handbook. I think chapter 4 talks about prayer. Please, I think, Kathy, I gave you a copy, didn't I? No, I gave you Spread the Word. There's another one in here for you if you want. So ask me if you need a copy of that book. We will get you one. We have a couple copies left. I strongly encourage you to get it. I'm just going to highlight some of the things and the ideas brought out and suggested from this book and give you the scriptural references that undergird the recommendation. One thing I strongly recommend you consider in your personal prayer life as you spend time with God to cure the problem of fear is praying in a solitary place every morning. We pull that from the life of Christ himself. And if you're a Christian, it is reasonable to assume that you would want to follow what Christ did. This is what Christ did. In the morning, he rose up just after the break of day. No, he actually didn't do that. Why wouldn't you do that? Because you're out of time. The kids are up. They want to be fed. The kids are late to school. You're late to work. The phone is going off. The texts are coming in. Other people are awake too. And the devil will use them to distract you and keep you from being with him. And you wonder why you have an anxious day. So you need to get up a great while, not a little while, a great while. Most of the former special forces will tell you they still get up at 4:30 in the morning because the rest of the world is typically hungover, still asleep. They're not active. And that leaves you free to focus on what you want to do with your life that day. Because if you don't do that, the sun goes down, and guess what? You have hardly done anything that day because you failed to plan, or you planned to fail, depending on how you think about it. So, get up a great while before day. And he goes out, he departed into a solitary place, and there he prayed. You don't have to, trek 30 minutes away from your home. You could just get out of the bedroom, past the kitchen, into the study, or some place where there's solitude. A place that provides you solitude, not necessarily a solitary place like the mountain picture I showed or something. Nothing wrong with that, call it a vacation, but some place where you're going to be uninterrupted by stuff or people or just seeing things in your room that will draw your attention or your thoughts away from being with God through prayer. If possible, kneel. This comes from the story of Gethsemane, as does the pray earnestly point from Gethsemane. Christ is there. The disciples see him. He's described as kneeling down. There are times, of course, when he was standing when he prayed. But there's something about the posture that you assume when you pray that affects the conversation. So there's going to be times, if you're not accustomed to kneeling, I suggest you try that. Try different postures. Kneeling emphasizes this distinction between the creator and the created, the master and the servant, the father and the child. Kneeling will accentuate that for you and add something to your prayers that other things cannot. Try praying aloud. Try praying aloud. If you've never done this, what I discovered when I first started doing it was that I realized I didn't have that much to say. Right? When you meet someone for the first time, you don't have much to say, do you? You don't know them. That's okay. Accept it. Enjoy the learning process. But you keep talking, don't you? And then, given sufficient time, you never run out of stuff to say. It's easy to go longer times in prayer when it's silent. You will be surprised how much, if you start doing a little more close self-observation of how much of your silent prayers are being prayed to you and not to God. Speak to him as you would a friend. Do it out loud. Don't let the silence get uncomfortable. He already knows what's in your thoughts and minds. Use it as an exercise of familiarity and grow that relationship with him by praying aloud. Pray earnestly, too. There are conversations that we have with each other that are in earnest because it reflects the seriousness of the conversation. These days, we all have serious conversations that need to be had with our Maker. So be earnest in your prayers. Don't just have the little parrot prayer that you can always pack into 30 seconds or less that addresses all the common things like, thank you for all you've done for me. Be with me, help us not get a car wreck when it snows. Thank we have good food in front of us. How many thousands of times have you said those things? And that's okay. But if my dad or my sister or my mom called me and the call was always less than 2 minutes and it always was the same thing, and somebody then asked me, how are you on good terms with your mom or your sister? I would say, I don't know. They call it, they say the same things. They think I forget or something. I don't know. They don't really talk much about the same things. It's just 2 minutes, it's over. It's just, and I hung up and, they call again, but it's always the same thing. I don't know. Think about how God feels when you say those kind of prayers to him. He's actually real, Final point here, pray persistently. Matthew 7:7 is a lot like the kind of the Revelation text where it's not just a one-time knock. It's not a one-time seek. It's not a one-time ask. You keep asking. If you keep asking, it shall be given you. If you don't quit seeking, you will find. If you don't quit knocking, it's going to be opened unto you. There was a parable in Luke 18 of the judge and the persistent woman. And the point of the parable, at the very beginning, it says in Scripture, verse 1 of Luke 18, that the reason why he told them this parable was to try to get them to understand that men ought always to pray. What ought they to do? To pray and not faint or get tired of it. What is it that sin tends to make us do? Do things we ought not and keep us from doing things that we ought to do. So what would the devil and sin tends to condition us that when you sin, when you fall, when you have a horrible day, what don't you do? Pray. What is it that you ought to do? Pray. You see how it fits? Paul describes it too in Colossians 1:9. For this cause we also, since the day we heard it, do not cease to pray for you. So it takes some time to build up to praying without ceasing, particularly if you're not accustomed to it, you're not really sure what you're supposed to talk about. Give it some time. Pray persistently, because prayer is a way for you to be with God. Bible study is the other major way, but that's not our topic today. Prayer, Bible study, witnessing, cooperating with Him to build the kingdom. Those are kind of the main things. Those come out of the sanctuary service model. But today we're focusing on prayer, which we see in the heavenly sanctuary imaged with the altar of incense there in the holy place. Prayer is a way for you to be with God, even though we're in a fallen state, alienated from Him. Prayer is a way to be with God. And to be with God is how we what? We cure fear by being with God. Very last verse of Matthew invokes these same ideas. It doesn't say, fear not, I'm with you always. Jesus simply says, lo. He says, listen, I've said it before. You've read through all the scriptures. Fear not, I'm with you. He says, lo, look, listen to me. I'm with you always. This is just before He ascends to heaven. Lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. And when the end of the world comes, what's it going to be like? It's going to be a time of trouble such as never was. There's going to be a lot of good reasons to be very afraid. In fact, there's one of the gospel writers who says, the men's hearts will do something for fear. They will fail them for the reason of fear. So, Hebrews 13:5 and 6. Let your way of life, that is conversation. Conversation is the King James Version of saying how you live your life. Not just the things you write or say or text. That's not the conversation. He's talking about let the way you live your life be without covetousness, and be content with what? Such things as you have. For He hath said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So what Paul is doing there is he's setting up a contrast. The reason why you can be content with whatever it is that you have, be it greater or less, the reason why you can avoid covetousness, which is breaking one of the commandments, is because He has said, I'm with you. If you lose everything and you have the Creator, is that really a problem? Why? Because He can create anything from nothing. That's why. But in the end, Revelation 13 describes a time when you will not be able to buy or sell if you have the seal of God. Will you be afraid enough to swap the seal for the mark? Will you be afraid enough of hunger to trade your soul for a mess of pottage? Esau did it for a bowl of food. Sold his birthright. What would it take for you to sell it? How much more inflation will it take to wipe out everything you have? And you can see it coming. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Is God enough? Is God alone enough for you to live on? That's the question that's coming. Fortunately, God gives us practice. It takes away a little bit here, a little bit there. We complain, we whine, we squirm. And He keeps us going in the process so that hopefully we get to the point where we're not afraid. Came to the point where I was not afraid of climbing. I enjoyed climbing. I still climb. Not often, but I still climb. I remember a particular climb I did with Don. And when you climb, some of the more enjoyable climbs are walls or mountains you've never been there. It's new. You have no idea how you're going to go from where you stand. Sometimes you can't even see where you're going. This can be troublesome. But when you're on the dull end of the rope, when you're cleaning, you don't have to know where you're going. I failed to mention it, and I did fail to bring it too. There's a little accoutrement, an accessory. It's called chalk bag. Chalk bag is particularly helpful for guys like me whose hands sweat like crazy when they get scared. Because you can dip your hands in the chalk bag, and it gets rid of the moisture, and you can actually hold the rock a lot better when you've got chalk on your hands. The walls are pretty nondescript in some places. You have no idea where you're going to hold on. You can't see. There's no major holds. You actually would practice sometimes with dimes to try to hang on a dime. My nails were kind of weak. I'm not the best guitarist. I'm not a great rock climber either, but you can actually hang on your fingernails. That's actually true. You can hang on your cats do it all the time. People can too. You can hang by your fingernails if you can see where the chalk is. If you look, and I can see where Don had climbed, I could see where he had been. The rope went where Don went. The chalk was where he had gone. And I just had to figure out how I could get my 5'7" arms to reach where his 6'2" arms could reach. And if I could just see where the chalk was, I knew there was a hole there. I know someone was there. Remember that vision where Ellen White says, we saw the blood on the wall, but we knew that meant people had gone before us, and we could keep going. We were going to make it. So I wanted to stop climbing sometimes, because I didn't know where to go. I just, good grief, it's like 1,000 feet down that way. I don't know where I'm supposed to go up there. What do you do? Well, where's the chalk? Where was someone else going? Put your hands right there. And sometimes you can't see it. I called up to Don once. I said, Don, how did you get through this? I hated overhangs. An overhang is where you come to a spot and the rope has to come over and you can't see the person above you. You can't see where you're going. And it gets really hard to manage your center of gravity as the wall becomes worse than vertical. It goes against you. That's an overhang. Okay? So to manage an overhang, which I never could do, is one, he said, well, what you could do is you can swing left and there's a hold to your left. You can't see it, but I can. If you will push off of the wall, I will hold the rope. And you're going to have to swing way to your left, and you're going to have to catch it. Now, when you're on the sharp end, how many chances do you get to catch the hold? You get one chance, because if you miss the hold, you fall. But I could try as many times as long as Don was holding the rope. I could swing out and try until I finally got it, and then I could climb around the overhang instead of going and managing the overhang and hanging by my hands and my toes. As long as he's holding the rope, I could do that. And as long as Jesus Christ is in the sanctuary as our mediator, the one mediator between God and man, you can fall as many times as is necessary for you to not give up on trying God's way. But when he leaves, there will be no one holding the rope. And you're either going to want to have completed the climb, be dead, climb of life. You're either going to want to be dead, or you're going to want to come to the point where you're a climber who doesn't fall. You're going to need to be ready to free solo. But that's what God is trying to train each and every one of us to do. He is able to keep us from what? Falling. Either that's true or it's a lie. There are people in our church and in religion who believe that's a lie. But the time will come when they will discover no one's holding their rope, and they will not be able to get back up. My prayer is that that will be none of us today, that we will either finish our climb or that we will continue climbing, even though it's scary. Keep climbing. Look at the rope, your connection, your prayer life to God. Look at the rope. Don't look down. It's not going to help you climb up. And watch for where others have gone. Watch for the chalk. Watch for the rope, and follow our leader. Let's. Do we have time for a closing song? Do we have a pianist? We want to do that? Yes. Okay. Please come forward to sing us a song, and then I'll dismiss us with a word of prayer. And wish you a happy new week.